Right, let's start the session. We have a few participants now, so that's great. Welcome to everyone. Welcome to InnoPark's first international online networking event. Just a few words to set the scene before I hand over to Chalotte Glintborg. So this session is recorded until we get to the end of the talk, and then I will stop the recording so that you can feel free to ask any questions you might want to ask the speaker. Just before we start, I'll be asking a couple of questions about you, doing it as a little poll, so we'll get to that in a minute. I'll be telling you about the Padlet we have for the event in a minute as well, and how to be involved. And then we'll have the main talk and the Q&A. So in terms of what I call the Padlet, so we're basically asking your contribution. The whole point of this networking week is that we want to engage the membership, and we want your ideas and your thoughts about the topic, which is psychosocial adjustment and psychosocial rehabilitation. But what are these terms? What do they cover? We obviously have our ideas, but we would like to have your ideas as well. So if you go to page 8 on in the delegate pack, there's a link. If you click on that, you get to the Padlet tool where there are some questions, and the option to put in your answers to these questions. We will also be covering those questions in the facilitated session on the 16th, on Thursday. So we hope to see as many of you as possible there, so you can be involved in thinking about this topic of that we are all working on. So apart from that, ways of being involved, you might already be a member of the LinkedIn group. Otherwise, please click on the link, and you'll find it in your delegate pack, and you can become a member. It's entirely free. If you are a lived experience representative, or if you are living with a chronic condition, with a long-term condition, you maybe have relatives who are, you could maybe want to join the lived experience group. If you want to do that, please contact Steph Kilic. Her email address is below on this slide. You might be interested in joining the leadership board, or maybe just hearing more about research collaborations, then please contact me. And that's the last email on this slide. So now I will first, oh, hang on a minute, I just need to stop sharing my screen. And then I will ask you just a few questions. If you would be so kind, you don't have to answer. These are single choice questions. If you feel more than one applies to you, just take the one that applies most in this context. It would be really helpful so we get an idea of who's actually, which type of people are participating in this. So I'll just have time for a couple more replies. Just a few more seconds. Right. I think we have the answers, and I will just share them. So this is great. We have somebody living with a long-term condition. We have a researcher and a clinician. And myself, I'm actually all three. So that's great. So I will now hand over to Chalotte Glintborg, who will talk about identity reconstructions in acquired brain injury. And when she's finished, I will stop the recording. So over to you, Chalotte. Looking forward to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. And I will try and share my screen. See if it works again. So does this look right on your screen?
Yes,
okay.
That's fine. That's fine. Yes.
Good. Well, I'm going to use this next 20 minutes or so to take you into a study I did and a field that I'm also doing research within, what affects adults, especially with acquired brain injury, what affect their identity after being disabled by an acquired brain injury. And the title of this presentation is Identity Reconstruction, and the focus is on narratives from adults with acquired brain injury. I'm an associate professor at the University of Aalborg in Denmark, in the northern region of Denmark, Department of Psychology. So I will present some results and a theoretical background also on this frame on narrative identity. So the research question for this study was, what affects identity after an acquired brain injury? And why did I do this study and why this focus? Often acquired brain injury is seen from a more pathological, biomedical angle, and also what triggers this process of identity is mostly seen as a pathological matter. But acquiring a brain injury is both a neurological trauma, but it's also a psychological trauma, and it highly affects not only a person's body and bodily functions, but this person's whole life, relatives included, and especially also identity. There has been a neglect of identity focus in rehabilitation in general, and more specifically also to look into this population, acquired brain injury survivors. And there has been this dilemma why we haven't looked into identity is mostly because that first-person perspectives from brain injury survivors have not been seen as reliable because they could lack insight, or we cannot take for granted, we took for granted what they say because it's their impact because of the brain injury, their memory is impacted, etc. So first-person perspectives from this client group has not been that included in research. So there's a strong need to put that focus out there. A little bit about the theoretical framework. Narrative identity, it rests on a discursive psychological approach where identity is understood as something that happens in and is constructed in interaction with others. It's not a stable state of mind, and it's not something inner, but it's something that's negotiated among individuals in specific social context, etc. And something that emerges and develops throughout your whole life. So it's not that you have a stable identity from the second you are born or your teenage years, that it's a way of looking on identity as something that's more fluent and can be impacted on who you are surrounded with, what you're doing, both your own narratives about yourself, but also what you're being told by others. In this study, there were 82 adults with acquired brain injury included, and they were all adults between 18 and 66 years. They were interviewed 3 times. The first time I met them was during hospitalization, and then I met them the second time 1 year after, and again 5 years post-injury. The analysis that I used was narrative identity analysis, and I looked to how these participants constructed their own identity and what self-narratives they were drawing on. And I looked at changes and how this time frame within 5 years affected their self-narratives and what kind of narratives were used at these 3 different time points. And I used the concept of agency and positioning, especially, which is developed by Hare and Van Langenhove. And I used Michael Bamberg's identity dilemmas, and that's the 3 points here. And he says that every time we need to develop our identity, we will meet these 3 dilemmas. The first thing is that we will see ourselves in a timeline between what is constant and what is changing, between myself, who was I before, who am I now, what will I be in the future. So it's also this time frame where I look at myself in comparisons to what I was or in my former years. And then there's the next dilemma about being the same and different from others. The first looks at oneself, comparing oneself to one's past. And the next is comparing yourself with others. Where am I the same? Some of us are researchers in this group that we're at right now. So we will be the same. Some of us are different. Some of us are clinicians. Some of us are not. So in that way, we can be different. But if we raise the level and we can say, well, we have identity reconstruction as a comparison here, that again, we're same. So in different levels, we can be the same. And in others, there is some difference. And I will show you more concrete what that means when I come to the analysis. And then there's the concept of agency. How much can I affect these identities that are given to me or given to me by others? And how can I reject them if I don't feel that they are suitable for me? And I will show you the concrete examples. So the results of this study was giving through some themes. That the first theme was that the participant reported that it was like they were being seen through a pair of warped glasses. They had this pre-injury identity that, well, as we know, everybody has certain traits that makes me the special kind of person I am. There's something that's more or less constant. Some of us can be forgetful, or some of us are more extrovert than others, and some are more introvert. And we also know that different events can affect how we look at things, and we could like take up our lives to revision and think, well, okay, this is not so important to work 70 hours per week because something has happened, and I kind of changed that. So we always have some core elements that makes us the persons we are. These core elements or traits or characteristic kind of change when you also get a diagnosis. And what the clients reported was, well, if you're forgetful and you also have an acquired brain injury, then it's almost always seen as only a symptom of the acquired brain injury. If they lack overview, or if they are very extrovert and more talkative, and you also have an acquired brain injury, then it could also be reported as a symptom. And you could be more impulsive than you were before, but maybe it's always been a characteristic that you have. And the thing they said, that even though these are symptoms of acquired brain injuries, the dangerous part here is that they felt that everything they did and all the behavior was seen as only a symptom. And when they said, well, I've always been very extrovert or outspoken or forgetful. When I drive to work, I have to turn the car around and because I've forgotten my phone. But then when they said that to professionals, this has always been me, this is not worse because of the brain injury, they would be answered with, well, you kind of lack insight then you need more awareness of your situation here and the symptoms of acquired brain injury. So there's a fine balance about seeing, what do you see? Is it only symptoms? Is it only the brain injury? Or do you also see what kind of person this is? And some of the symptoms is maybe not only symptoms, but it's also who the person was before. The second theme was this balance between normalization and pathologizing. And there's an example here. This is Mette. She was a younger woman in her 20s. And she says, it has affected me really much, totally. I've been down 100 times, then up again and down. I wanted a divorce, to commit suicide. I just wanted to disappear and not come back again. I went to the Brain Injury Rehabilitation Center for 2 years, and I saw a psychologist there, and she helped me put a lot of things into place. And I don't think I would have been here today if it wasn't for her. If she hadn't told me the things she did, it was groundbreaking. Now I'm starting to get emotional. She just put so many things into place, incredible. And then I asked her what kind of things were groundbreaking. You mean what the psychologist did? She told me things and told me it was totally okay and it was normal to feel like that. And just that, what a relationship we had. I could just talk to her about everything, all kinds of weird things that I felt. And then she just said, it's okay, Mette, I've had similar feelings. I would put it like this: if she had not been there, I don't think I would have made it into the other side mentally. And what's happening here, there are two core elements. The psychologist, it could be either professional, it didn't have to be a psychologist, but in this case it was. But the thing the psychologist do in this example is that she normalizes what is happening to Mette. And she doesn't say, well, that's just because of your brain injury, and even diagnoses her further, because Mette had emotional consequences. She had a depression following her brain injury, and she was very sad. And as you can see, well, she wanted a divorce. She was even so far out there that she wanted to commit suicide. But the psychologist here says, well, it's normal to feel like that when something this traumatic has happened to you. So she doesn't pathologize her further, but says this is normal to have it like that. And the second thing she does is that she includes herself. She says that I've had similar feelings. And in the poll Liz just did was this question, if you have lived experience. And I don't know if this psychologist have lived experience, but she includes herself. And this normalization and this shared humanity, that you cannot go through lives without feeling emotional distress at times. And that professional includes their own experience. It's not that the psychologist in this example tells her life story or what happens to her, but she's not only a professional that something never happens to on this pedestal, but that she is also a human being with feelings. And these feelings that Mette has, it's not that maybe the psychologist didn't have thoughts of suicide, but that life is hard. And there can be those times when you feel extreme feelings. So with reference to the identity dilemmas proposed by Michael Bamber, the therapist here construct a sameness with Mette. Mette is not different from others. And there's a risk that as professionals, we can create this difference, that this is only something that happens to clients. It could never happen to a professional. And that makes an unequal relationship. So in this example, there is this sameness with Mette. And for Mette, this made a tremendous help. The third theme is this same but different, and when continuity is threatened. This is also an example from Mette. And when I met her the first time, during the first meeting, Mette expressed that she was happy and relieved that she got off so easy. She often finds it hard to look at the other clients at the rehabilitation center who are more severely affected by the brain injury. She seems happy, cheerful, and smiles during the interview. Mette is being discharged later this day after only 2 weeks of hospitalization, since she did not have physical consequences. So in this example, we can see how Mette compares herself to other clients hospitalized at this rehabilitation center, and she feels different. She's positively different because she's not that affected and she's only there for a short stay. And we can see that I also co-construct Mette as happy and even cheerful. So I kind of support her in this identity as different from others. She got off easy. She was not that affected by her brain injury. But something happens between the first interview and the next time I meet her 1 year after. And the interview starts as, or the example starts as this. I ask her, is there anything in this short rehabilitation that has given you any new positive experience? No, but it's also difficult because you see, I'm not that affected physically. It's highly, highly psychological. But because you're not affected physically that much, they could not really help me. Okay, so did you miss anything? I do not know. You see, it was so hard having a brain injury, and people could not see it on me. And it was so hard to be in a situation where you're ill, but people could not see it. So here you can see that the balance between the physical and the psychological part. She was not affected so hard physiologically, but what remained a challenge for her was the psychological part. But since they could not help her, she was not offered psychological support after the first year. That was just later in the process. She did not receive any help in that direction. And then there's also this sameness and difference dilemma. You see, I'm the social med who has always been the clown, who got totally wasted at the disco. And now I cannot even consider having the one drink. And sometimes my friends say to me, oh, they missed the old med. Do you miss her? Yes, I miss her so much. You see, it's a new med that has come. Who is this new med who is about to come? And will my friends accept her, this new identity? And will they see me as I was before? So now you see this is a really extreme example here, and she almost give it really direct reveals of how identity can be affected, and she says it very clearly. And you can see that there is this young woman who, in comparison to the first meeting, now first of all feels psychological, challenged and changed. And she also constructs her identity as changed, and not only her own narratives about herself, but highly also how others will see her and how they will accept this new meta. So she is in a transition from being social to living in a box, as she said. So she's navigating this constancy and change dilemma at this time point. And how we can see this? Well, she is saying, I am. So she's trying to hold on to the social meta she was, but cannot participate in the same social actions that will enhance this identity and hold on to this identity. And her friends construct an identity loss. We miss the old meta, so they challenge this identity, her old identity. I also construct an identity loss and say, do you miss her? So I also invite her to say that you lost the old meta. And meta is somewhere in between. She's balancing it, and there's some ambivalence in her narratives. And she's also looking into what will come in the future. Lack of hope was also a theme. And this is given by Eric and Jasper, these examples. And the first from Eric says that they, the professional, destroy people's hope and the motivation you have to get better. Eric describes how he was informed that he should not expect more progress 5 years after the brain injury. But it's important to have hope. The improvement you make is important. I can still see improvement from week to week. And Jasper says they have been busier showing me what I'm not able to do than what he was able to do. And within neuropsychology, there has been this tradition, and it has been seen as good practice to confront persons with brain injury with their disabilities, with this aim of that this confrontation will lead to greater insight and acceptance of their disabilities, and then to greater motivation to work with these difficulties. However, in practice and also in research, we have seen that confrontation do not necessarily lead to increased motivation, just the contrary, that individuals are seen to give up and lose motivation and it could lead to mental resistance. So therefore, we might need to rethink this concept of insight and what leads to insight. So yeah, and just in addition to that, reject this kind of insights and the maintenance of narratives that hold on to prior competencies can also work as this form of self-enhancement, a way of protecting yourself because you're not ready to give up on that identity yet. So it could be a coping mechanism or ways of, yeah, this self-enhancement. So you need this psychological approach also to look into what's going on. It's not only and always just lack of insight. It could be a way of protecting and preventing further emotional distress. The next theme here is represented by Lillian about personal competencies and resilience. And she says, you have seen a lot of different types at the rehabilitation center, who each have their own approach to life. I have thought a lot about why some people so quickly become chronic in their condition while others don't. And I've come to the conclusion that it has to do with what you have in your backpack, what you have seen through life, that you have a strong will to do things every day. What we do in our life is about will. We talk way too little about personal competencies and how to work with them and to develop them. Where do we get our identity from? There can be several generations on social welfare in your family, and it can be those patterns you narrate yourself from. So this has to do with exploring personal competencies, the personal factor of also the ICF, not only assessing what people can't do physiologically or cognitively, but also exploring who are this person, what are these competencies and preferences this person also has, and are there problems in life transitions we need to address, and how did they handle these prior to the injury? So not, again, only focus on pathologies, but also who are these persons and what are these competencies, and that gives you a way into also looking at resilience, which is another concept that is also important to include when we look at psychosocial adjustment and psychological rehabilitation. And I will not get into more details on that right now because time is also running. So I will jump to the sixth theme, which is around shame and self-criticism, which is also a central theme I've seen again and again in this field within brain injury. And this is Tina saying, I'm not the same person. My self-confidence has changed. What I used to be great at doing, I can't do anymore. And that again affects your identity, and it could be shameful to recognize that you're not able to be the parent you were before the injury, or the wife, or etc. And Stanley here gives an example. It was terrible because it was so hard. I knew that the task that was some mathematical task as part of a neuropsychological assessment were simple. However, they were still incredibly difficult for me to solve. After half an hour, I finally finished the task, but I was overwhelmed with hopelessness and despair and started to cry in front of the neuropsychologist. And again, when I was alone in the afternoon, it was a surreal experience. Will I ever be able to help my children with their homework? So yeah, to sum up, that these findings and the research into emotional experience of brain injury survivors has indicated that there is this internal and external shame and self-criticism, and it also needs to be addressed as part of the neurorehabilitation, as examples that shows here from Stanley. And to sum up on the whole study and this identity reconstruction perspective, there seems to be a need to rethink notions like lack of insight and lack of motivation. Is it always lack of insight? Or as I mentioned earlier, could it be ways of dealing with things to protect yourself to things that are still too difficult to deal with? And then there's this recognition of our shared humanity, that it's crucial, and instead of dehumanizing and pathologizing brain injury survivors, normalization is extremely important and an aspect to consider further in their treatment. And the psychological and existential aspect of the biopsychosocial model is still very sparsely addressed in rehabilitation practices. And the person with brain injuries are not offered support in coping with their emotional distress, not systematically, and including their identity problems. So we need to look more into how can we support this identity transition as part of neurorehabilitation as well. This was the end. Thank you for your attention, and this will open up for questions now.
Just before we take the questions, I will just stop the recording